Hey everyone, and welcome to a Monday episode of Authors and Agents. I have the wonderful author Anuradha Rajurkar on the podcast with me today. We chat about her debut novel, American Betiya, and she tells me about the 10 years she spent writing this book. She drops some really great query tips and then tells me a little bit about her, daily writing schedule, what that looks like for her, how she gets things done. But before we go ahead and get to know her, I want to tell you about my favorite book of the week. I read this book really fast and just couldn't put it down. It's called These Witches Don't Burn by Isabel Sterling, and it came out a couple of years ago. Crazy, the 2019. It doesn't feel that far away. But it came out in May of 2019, so you might have heard of it. It has a sequel that's out as well. And it's about elemental witches, which is right now, I have some elemental magic going on in my works in progress and one of my books that I'm querying. So that's why I was really interested in it. And it's such a great story. It has some really good romance, some tension between Hannah, who is the main character, and her ex-girlfriend, and then she, meets a new girl, and there's someone who's doing dark magic in their town, which is Salem, Massachusetts, and she's trying to figure out who this new threat is to her and her coven. And it's really good, very fast-paced, very well written. So if you haven't read These Witches Don't Burn by Isabel Sterling, I definitely recommend it. Now, let's go ahead and get to know Anuradha. All right, let's go ahead and start off by having you tell me about your upcoming novel, American Betiya.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. So my debut is a YA contemporary, as you said, called American Betiya. It's a cross-cultural love story that releases March 9th, 2021 with Knopf Penguin Random House. It follows 18-year-old Ronnie, who gets swept up in butterflies when she first meets Oliver, who's kind of a quintessential bad boy on the out, in the beginning. But it's the challenges that they encounter as an interracial couple that allow her to recognize real love for what it is. It's a story that I needed as a South Asian American, born and raised in the Midwest. The story came from my own need to explore love, culture, the immigrant experience, empowering female friendships, and the impact they all have when negotiating our own identity. So it's the space that I use to delve deeply into how sexuality, cultural taboos and expectations, and also racism and patriarchy all play into our sense of self as young women growing up.
I love it.
In America.
I love it. I love that you wrote the book that you needed as a kid growing up, in the background that you have. And so then that there are, people who, other kids just like you were, are going to be able to see themselves in something. And I think that's really special.
It is amazing to be having some early readers reach out already, like through Instagram, saying, oh my gosh, even the names of the names of the grandparents or the name for grandparents. Aji means grandmother and Azuba means grandfather. So I got a reader write to me just this morning saying just to see those names in a book was so amazing. And it just felt really, it's nerve-wracking in these, especially in these upcoming weeks, where it's like, okay, this is the final, right about to launch, and am I doing all the things? And just to hear that, okay, the story resonates, and that's what it's for. It's for people to feel connected, and it sort of brought things back to my center, in terms of why do we write? What is all of this for? So that has been really cool to see. People are resonating with the story.
That's so wonderful. I mean, that's definitely the dream, and why we write and why we have these stories. I remember, those feelings of connecting with stories so strongly as a teenager, and even now there are stories, as an adult that I'm like, oh my gosh, I just can't stop, reading this, and that is so special. It's such a connection between, reader and author, and for you to have people feel that about your words is what we all hope for.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
Wonderful. Well, this is such an exciting time. You're so close to having the book come out. Tell me a little bit about your journey to this point, to having, your debut novel published.
Absolutely. Well, it's the story, as I kind of intimated, that I really wanted to write ever since I was a teen, honestly. I think it was one of those stories in the back of my mind that I felt needed to be told. And I had honestly been kind of thinking about it since then. I mean, I became a teacher, and I decided to, and then I was a mother. So I stayed home with my kids for a while, and around that time, when I left teaching for a few years to raise my two sons, who were very close in age, so it was like no question that I would sort of just be home and be a stay-at-home mom for those years, which I loved. But I would get a babysitter and have her come over I think it was like 6 hours a week. I mean, it was really not very much, but I would just cross the street, go to the library with my computer, and write. And I think back to that time, and I'm like, wow, I never wanted to go shopping or we were very new to Milwaukee. We had just moved here, so I actually didn't have any friends yet. And so it was like, okay, with that free time, I'm going to be writing. And so that's when the story kind of began, when my kids were really young. It was a short story. At the time, I was really obsessed with Alice Munro and other short story writers, Jhumpa Lahiri, and I wrote a short story, and then I ended up meeting a woman through a coffee and kids group named Lauren Fox, who is an incredible writer. At the time, she had not published even her first one yet. She invited me to her writing group, and it's just such crazy dumb luck, to have stumbled upon somebody wonderful who I connected with, who then also is a writer and invited me to her writing group. It's just like, you can't make this stuff up. It was so awesome. And immediately after reading my short stories, she was like, I think you should turn this into a novel. And it was sort of like it was like the permission that I needed. It's like all those years, I kind of didn't have a lot of confidence in myself. I didn't really have a lot of support I should say my family is wonderful and loving and supportive, but like a career in writing is not something that my immigrant parents were going to back up, right away when I was a teenager. It's like, so it was teaching, and I loved teaching, but it was definitely, writing was sort of that pipe dream in the back of my mind. So to have somebody say, yes, this is good enough to write it, flesh it out into a full-length novel was just amazing. It was just one of those turning points. So I did just that. It took me a very long time to write. I was teaching. I went back to teaching and raising a family, and I was sort of fitting writing in here and there, like on the weekend, at night. And I ended up writing a story that's basically twice the length of a normal book. I don't know what I was thinking. I think I was just trying to get the story out. Yeah. And I didn't really pay attention to conventions. What is the word count? I literally don't even think I checked word count. That's how strange it was. So I ended up with this 166,000 word document, manuscript by the end. And my poor long-suffering writing group read every page of that. We would meet once a month, and they would give their feedback, and they had really positive feedback, and honestly no one complained about the fact that I was writing this book for really over 10 years. I mean, it's kind of an embarrassing thing now to think back, because they were churning out books every couple years. There'd be a new book. And so at one point, I finally decided, I need to have a deadline here. There needs to be an endpoint. And I joined SCBWI years ago. I found out about the Emerging Voices Award, and that it was the deadline was in November. And it was, this was back in 2018, I believe. And I thought, okay, November, I'm going to get this thing whipped into shape. I met another critique partner who writes only YA, and she read the story and said, I think that, first of all, obviously you need to cut half of the story out. So she helped me figure out, which subplots can go, and, some of the writing as well was very kind of a little bit flowery. It needed to be streamlined. So she sort of helped me, figure that out, which was amazing. And she also said, I'd like you to try turning it from past tense to present tense, which was just oh my gosh, kill me right now. Go back to the beginning and start with present tense. But she was, of course, completely right. It's after that first chapter, I'm like, oh my gosh, that made an incredible difference. So just going back to the drawing board, doing all that cutting, doing all the streamlining. But I got it in shape, before the November 5th, I think it was November 15th deadline. I sent it to them and just said, okay, done. Like, now I'm going to just start querying. So, I learned about the querying process. I know that's one of our upcoming questions.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay for me to just
of course.
talk about the querying process?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so, I just, after sending it to SCBWI, I just hunkered down and started to figure out who am I going to be sending this to. So I learned about, through MSWL, Manuscript Wish List, which is the hashtag on Twitter, where, bunches of different agents are talking about what they're looking for. So that was actually really revealing. Like, I had not spent any time on the industry part of publishing. It was just my story. And so it definitely was a very, steep learning curve. I had looked at the back of the books. Like, my writing group had told me, look at the back of the books of those stories that feel similar in tone or content, to what you've written. So I did that, and one of the first agents I queried was like a really, really super top agent, which I probably should have written to him, after a few tries. But that's okay. I mean, it was kind of a really rough query letter. I'm so embarrassed now when I think about that very first version of that query letter.
Oh, yeah.
It was a mess. I mean, it was nobody should have read that query letter but myself. So, of course, I didn't even receive a response. But the good news about not receiving a response when you send out a query letter is it's your query letter. That is the one thing you need to work on, right? It's they don't even have your manuscript yet, or they might have your maybe first 10 pages, but it's you kind of have to feel okay, there's something here that needs reworking. So again, going back to my writer friends, with my horrible query letter, getting their input, and then of course online, there's just so much information now on, anything that you want to, regarding querying and agents and the publishing industry. So I just spent time, honestly, because I had never spent time doing any of this learning. So I learned a lot about even how to, on MSWL, and that hashtag, it was amazing how agents were describing what they were looking for, even the term, the language they were using. I was okay, that's exactly what my story is, and yet I don't use that language in my query letter.
Yeah.
I didn't know. And so just sort of selecting elements of what they're looking for, pulling that into your query letter, immediately made it so much sparkier, and it felt okay, this is really describing in a streamlined way what my story even is about, because even now I have a hard time talking about what is my story about. It's okay, I could talk for an hour about what it's about, and no, it really needs to be. And so some of those things I learned just through learning about what agents are looking for. So that was huge. I'm trying to think what was the next thing I did. I created a list of just 4 to query at a time, so that, once they responded, it's not overwhelming. It's okay, I got these responses. One is no one responded at all. One is, okay, this didn't connect with me and this is why. Those little elements help you go back to your query letter and keep tweaking, or those first 10 pages. If somebody says, oh, I really didn't like this one character, he came off really gruff, or it was just hard to get behind it because this person felt too extreme, I thought, okay, that totally makes sense. And, those rejections, they're painful, but they're also you're so hungry at a certain point for just information about your work,
exactly.
Because you shared it just with your small pod, and which is awesome to have a small pod, but to not have really talked to anybody within the industry, it started to feel oh my gosh, I just need whatever information you have, give it to me. So that was really nice to sort of be in that space of, I don't have to feel horrible about myself or, beat myself up over doing that. It's nope, just go back to the drawing board and keep tweaking and send it on to the next person, So getting into that groove is really nice. It helped to be part of Query Tracker. I found that to be, that's a free resource too, and you get to see where your query is in the lineup of other queries for a particular agent. So you start to see, okay, mine's getting closer to the top. They're about to get to mine. And, and it says, like, it marks whether they've rejected the people above and below you. And, so you kind of get a sense like, wow, they reject a lot of people, which in a sense is also helpful to be like, okay, rejections are just a part of this process, and I'm not going to be a hothouse flower about this. I'm going to be opening my heart and my mind to what they have to say. And even if it's a no response rejection, it's okay. You just feel less alone, I think,
Yes.
looking at that query tracker, which I appreciated. And then, of course, just listening to things like track changes, Sarah Ennie's track changes. I looked into Publishers Marketplace was another thing that I became a member of, I think, for a couple of months, where you can really look up these different agents and editors, find out, who are the top agents in what categories, in what genres, and what are their latest deals, so they can read, what stories are being published and being picked up. Of course, you can also see this on Twitter. But at the time, I was not really well versed with Twitter. I didn't really know how to use Twitter or Instagram. I was kind of prided myself on not being a huge social media person and just focusing on the writing, which, was good, but then also bad in some ways. So I had to sort of get back into the social media scene and the book community online, which ended up being really wonderful in many ways. You learn a lot. And so, sort of slowly moving myself into that was the tactic, was sort of the strategy I used without really meaning to have that as a strategy. But so, yeah, Publishers Marketplace, Query Tracker, Manuscript Academy was another place where I learned a lot. There were some podcasts that were really helpful, and they were also offering, different critiques from industry professionals for a fee, where they your choice of either query in first 10 pages or your first 50 pages, or I think even 250 pages. I mean, it's expensive, but it just felt like, okay, these are some options. And, especially in those moments where I felt like, oh, gosh, I'm not hearing back from, agents quickly, and I was starting to feel a little bit like, am I on the right track? So I did spend a little money to get somebody to look at my first 10 pages, I believe that was. So I used that. And then magically I heard from SCBWI, and I found out that I won the Emerging Voices Award. And that was sort of just like blew everything up. Like, okay, this is happening. Things happened really quickly after that. Part of the award is that the SCBWI Emerging Voices they had a short list of agents that they felt were looking for my kind of story. Stories written by authors from underrepresented communities. And so it got sent out to a bunch more agents, and within a few days I got a call from an agent, which is my current agent who I selected, and Alex Slater, and he offered representation. So I wrote to all the other people who had my manuscript at the time, who I had queried, and let them know that I received the offer of representation. And at that point, I got a couple of other offers then within a few days. So then I had to select between the three offering agents, which was just an amazing moment after so many, really it was almost over 10 years of writing the same story. And then to be at this point just felt so indescribable, really. It was unreal. And, part of the SCBWI award was to go out to LA, to the SCBWI LA conference, and meet with an editor there and have her check out my story. So it was just a whirlwind after that, and super exciting, and also nerve-wracking to be like, oh, I don't even have a real Twitter account, just like needing to sort of get into that sphere quickly. But it was lovely, and I'm really grateful to SCBWI for reading, for picking it up, for choosing it. And the other winner for the middle grade was Lakita Wilson. And so Lakita and I connected, and it was just lovely to finally be connecting with people within the YA genre, because everyone in my writing group writes literary fiction. So that was the start of everything for me.
That's awesome. And I feel like, too, I feel a lot of authors, their journey was that way. Like, oh, I wrote, 5 manuscripts or worked on this manuscript for 5 years. And then everything happened really fast and, like, snowballed once, I got to a certain point. So it's like you're learning, like, perseverance and patience, which helps you deal with the publishing industry in whole, because it runs so slowly. But I think you brought up so many good things about querying. I think we all have made that mistake of sending a query letter that's, like, not good. I think we've all done that. I definitely have had my share of that. And Query Tracker is such a great resource. Even if, I know some people do it in, like, Excel, which is great if you want to create your own, like, little tracking document. But yeah, being as organized as you can about it too is, for me at least, helps take off some of the stress of it, because then I like to be able to track it and see, even just marking off who's rejected it, then I'm like, oh, okay, I can send out another query because I got this rejection back. That's one thing that I like to do. But, I'm glad that you took the time you did and the journey you did. I think we look back on different things in our lives and, like, you wouldn't be where you are right now, right, if you hadn't gone through that journey.
That's exactly right. It does feel as though, I was embarrassed to tell people I worked on this story for this many years. It's not like I slaved on it every single day for 8 hours a day, but still, that in itself, there's shame. And that's one thing that I would love to remove from the equation for so many of us, is so much shame, in so many different aspects of this. There's shame if you are getting rejections. There's a feeling of shame if you've taken a long time to write a book, or, it's an endless sort of cycle, and it's not useful. It doesn't serve us at all. Maybe some people are motivated by that. That's like, not wanting to feel shame, but I personally am not one of those people, and it would be nice to just be kinder to ourselves and to see this process as it is. So for some people, it is a fast journey, and that's awesome. But for many of us, it isn't, and there's no shame in that. And so, I'm not sure, like, how to get that message out. Even like in my, in social media and stuff, I would love to sort of embrace that in a way and express that in a way that resonates with people.
Yeah. I think you're so right on that. We take away shame and we replace it with grace. Like, be graceful with yourself. Give yourself grace in all aspects of your writing journey and just, like, normal life. But yeah, I think too, it's the comparison game of, like, it's so easy nowadays to just compare ourselves to everyone all day, because people post their perfectly curated lives on social media, and that's how we communicate a lot, right? But that's not always real. So, I feel like I say it a lot to myself, but I also try and do the same thing where I share with people, like, give yourself grace. Don't be hard on yourself. Don't compare your journey to somebody else's, because you don't know really how long or, the truth of all of it sometimes.
Exactly. Even the story, when I think about the very first germ of the idea, the very first seeds, it was really, really very different. But because I took so long to write the book, I feel like my world view changed, because there were certain elements of the story I don't think I understood, or I know I didn't understand when I first began it. And that's part of the reason it was kind of a mess to, like, it ended up being super long, and then, okay, well, what is the story even really about? Like, I really had to go inward and figure that out, but I think it was those years that helped me figure it out, and so while I don't necessarily, like, recommend spending, 12, 13 years writing one story, in some ways it really did. It worked for this particular story. I do think that there were so many things going on in my head and in my heart in terms of, like, what I experienced, what elements do I want to share with the world and talk about and really excavate. it was really hard to figure what those things were. And one of the people who are actually the friend of mine, the critique partner, who read it when it was in that ridiculous, very long stage, her name is Lisa Weimer, and she wrote The Assignment, which is an incredible book that came out this past August.
Yeah, I've heard of that book.
Yeah, it's received a lot of critical acclaim and has won an award. And she had told me that, basically we spent 2 8-hour days back to back, and she kind of almost like interviewed me about what the story is about. And at one point I was like literally broke down in tears, because she was sort of like trying to get at the heart of it. And I was somehow resistant to it. So it just shows like writing is also just an incredibly emotional process.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes it does take that much time to figure out what is it that you are trying to say. And, is the form that it's in right now, are you really saying it? Or do we need to bring that out in different ways? And so, so anyway, that's kind of the story of how it all came to be.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so, glad that you are, where you are now. My next question, I'd love to know when you're writing, when you're drafting, do you find yourself as more of a pantser, more of a planner, or are you somewhere in between?
Yeah, I would say I'm somewhere in between for sure. I like to have a rigid outline and then give myself permission to stray from it as things arise in the scenes and characters that I didn't originally see coming, but that do make sense with the themes and the character arc. So I do feel like that outline just makes the writing process so much less stressful. Like I know when I sit down at my, at my desk, it's like, okay, this is what comes next, and I'm going to start there. And, because I think I've tried both ways, actually. I think that basically the first early years of my book was kind of pantsing it. And I think after just how much I went through with that book, in terms of so many revisions, and it just made me realize that it would have been so much better had I had a much more rigid outline.
Yeah.
Which I kind of had maybe the second half of the book. Like I was a little bit more like, all right, let's get this under control here, because characters really wanted to do all kinds of crazy things. I mean, if you just sit down and, and it's like kind of depends on your mood of the day, and it just feels like, okay. And sometimes amazing things happen out of that. But a lot of times amazing things don't happen, or like it really takes you in a different direction. And then to rein it all back in is sort of a painful process. Like, okay, I got to actually cut out that entire scene. It just feels like no. So I feel like I'm sort of past that point of total pantser, and I have mad respect for people who are pantsers. But I feel like when I tried that, it didn't work that well for me. So I'm more of a planner now, and I like the rigid outline from a starting point. Yeah. And I do find, though, often that I go off course as long as I sort of keep in mind, okay, what is my theme? What do I want to have change over the course of this particular scene, and how does that relate to the larger themes? So I think I'm a little bit more aware of that now than I used to be, which I appreciate and I'm grateful for.
Yeah. I think that is something, too, that just comes with time and experience of writing, because the second manuscript I ever wrote, I pantsed it because doing a rigid outline and outlining the whole story beforehand doesn't work for me. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to try and just be free and just see what comes to me, which I really loved. And I love the way that story turned out, but I do think it lends to a lot more time revising, which I'm like, it's my least favorite part of the process. So I'm like, anything I can do to cut down on revising, I will do. So now I'm more in between. I plan things out like for each act that I write. And usually I know too, like my midpoint and my climax before I get into the big meat of the story. But I do like planning the next few scenes as I go. And that helps me feel not so like tied down by an outline. But what I love about this question is that we all do it so differently. I think, this is where you have to give yourself grace to and not compare yourself to other writers, because there are writers who do pantsit and they don't have to revise a lot and it turns out amazing. And there are some,
exactly.
who are so great and their outlines are so detailed that it makes writing the book like a breeze. But we all find our own process.
It's so true. And it is interesting, though. Sometimes I just feel like in outlining, it's very hard, especially if it's early on in the stages of, realizing the story and you're putting it down on paper. You don't know the characters. At least I don't feel like I know my characters well enough to have every scene fleshed out amazingly.
Yeah.
I mean, I can have a general idea, and like you said, having the climax is important at the end, and just having a general idea of what you want to happen at the end, the midpoint is useful. But yeah, all that other stuff in the middle is like, oh, I don't really know her yet,
Yeah.
And so it's very murky. It's almost hard to even talk about. There's so much mystery, and it's such an enigmatic process, really, when you. And like you said, it's different for every story. Some stories do just, you have a vision and it would just flow, I imagine, for some people based on what I've heard. So, yes, it's kind of an interesting how it's almost hard to say, well, this is what I ordinarily do.
Right.
I feel like I ordinarily do everything different every time on some levels. So, not that helpful, I guess, in terms of a podcast. But
no.
Yeah, a little bit of both is basically the short answer to that.
Awesome. Well, I love it. I think it changes too depending on what you're writing. So I don't think that that's a bad answer at all. I think that could be comforting for somebody else who's like, what my normal process isn't working for this story. And, that might just be because you need to do it a little bit differently. Sometimes different stories call for writing it a different way. And that's like the most frustrating answer too, but sometimes that's the way the cookie crumbles. Well, next, I would love if you could share with me something your readers wouldn't know about you.
Oh gosh, this is a good one. So there's a few things, but the main thing I would say is I tend to write a lot about trauma, the darker sides of love. I mean, also there's a lot of really great funny best friend banter in my books. I love female friendships, in relationships and great family relationships. But I do like to kind of delve in deeper to sort of some darker and deeper themes. But I'm actually kind of a romantic cheeseball at heart. I mean, I love romantic comedies, but I just find even when I want to, I cannot seem to write them. So it's like, but, my true soul is like a true romantic. My perfect night includes just time with my kids, endless hours curled up with my, beloved in front of the fire, walking on the beach, cuddled in front of a movie. I mean, very like introvert's paradise of just like being with your love. And so I think that's something that especially readers who would read the story maybe wouldn't necessarily know about me.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's fun to just get to know authors, as people a little bit better. Sometimes it can be like, oh, it's this mystical creature that wrote this book that I'm in love with. And so, make you humanize us all a little bit.
Exactly. That sounds lovely.
Well, my next question is worded on a typical day, which I feel like I should take out because there's no typical day anymore. But what does your writing schedule look like? How do you motivate yourself to, get words down? Do you have like a time limit or, like a time goal that you set for yourself or a word count goal? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I love this question. My goal is to write at least for 6 hours a day.
Whoa.
That being said, it really does depend on what's going on in your life. As I said, when my kids were little, 6 hours a day, and the stage you are in, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way I was doing 6 hours a day. So I'm answering this question from the standpoint of now. My kids are much older and very independent, and I have taken a leave of absence from teaching, so I'm actually home, and this entire COVID time I have been home. So, I mean, 6 to 8 hours, honestly, is not so out of the realm of normal for me nowadays. And part of it is that I feel like it's just slow. Like I need to spend, it takes at least a couple hours for me to even get into the groove of like, churning out words. It's not that I'm not writing during that time, but a lot of that is note-taking or looking out the window and just thinking. And so 6 to 8 hours is kind of my goal. And then the latest thing I've been trying to do is say, well, what if I have a word count goal? Well, I'm not like a word count person, obviously, but I do feel like, what if I try that? So my latest thought is to try to do 1,000 words a day. And it's happening. I wouldn't say I can do it every day, though. So that's where I sort of feel like the hours thing feels a little bit more comfortable for me, because if I say, look, I'm just, if I do 3 hours in the morning and then 3 hours in the evening, and sometimes that happens where the day is just busy and you're running around and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to get back to it later. So I like that flexibility, just from the standpoint of not being too rigid, but giving the time that it sort of needs and deserves. Otherwise, I notice that I start to feel sort of angsty, if I'm not really giving it the time. And I remember that even when my kids were young, it would just be weekends really, or sometimes a couple nights on those nights that I wasn't completely exhausted.
Right.
But it is important personally for mental health, for me to feel like I am putting that time in at my desk.
Oh, yeah.
Whether it's reading, whether it's writing, note-taking, thinking, planning. And I'm also now lately trying to really just work in reading time as part of those hours. So sometimes that reading time is just at night in bed. But to be really regular about that, I feel like I wasn't for some years in there. I would read, I'd go through these spurts of reading, but it really, to have that as part of your daily ritual and as part of your writing life, I think is extremely important. I mean, when you think about how many ways we are influenced throughout our day, even the shows you watch on Netflix or the movies that you see, I mean, these are stories, and everybody's take on the story and the way they tell the story is so, unique and brings something different to also just the cultural conversation. I feel like all of these elements are important in producing our writing. So that has been like kind of a more holistic view on the writing life than I've ever had before, and it's so it's just so inspirational. I mean, even just taking in art, especially during COVID, I find myself, finding artists on Instagram and following them and, reading about their processes. It brings something different. And then you're also, in terms of like what you were talking about with comparison or what we were discussing with shame, it sort of removes that a little bit because, they're creators, but they're creating within, a different medium, and yet it's still very inspiring and informs your work. So I think that whole 6 to 8 hours that I'm saying writing, I don't know if that's all writing every single day. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a collection of all of these different ways that writing also art that informs our writing is also a huge part of the process, is what I'm actually starting to realize more than ever. So that's been really kind of a cool discovery.
Yeah. I think my listeners probably know already what I'm going to say, but I always say that you can't be a writer unless you're a reader. I don't think it's possible. I'm sorry. If you don't read books, you can't be a writer, at least not a very good one. I think that reading, whether it's in your genre, outside your genre, nonfiction, if you write fiction, anything is so helpful for me mental health wise too, and just for the creative process. You find yourself analyzing, at least I do. I find myself analyzing books and TV shows and movies, and it's so helpful to just see story and how it is created by other people. I feel like you kind of answered the next question about, writing being emotionally draining and all of this stuff, and, you've started to realize that, there's so much that goes into it, and keeping yourself healthy mentally so that you can do this very like taxing process. Because writing a book is not like dandelions and cupcakes all the time, right? Like there's a lot of yourself
Absolutely.
that goes into it, and a lot of, hard moments sometimes, especially if, for me, so I found myself like working through issues as I write, So I think, making sure you're taking care of yourself and doing other things that allow you to write the best you can is so important.
Absolutely. And that, and I mean, when I'm in the throes of a new story, which I am now with my book too, it's so exciting, but it's also like, when was the last time I really moved my body? It's like,
yes.
You can get, it's wonderful to be in that space where you're like up at 3 a.m. scribbling things in the dark, and you can't sleep. It's like, okay, awesome, but also not awesome. It's like, okay, we do need to have a more balanced, lives, and whether that is like we talked about, just reading and watching movies and shows, but also just being with family, like finding time to be with friends, even if it's a Zoom call. It's just, and again, just exercise. And I love green smoothies. It's like the one thing. I can't really drink coffee because I'm a migrainer, and it sort of triggers. So having my green smoothie in the morning for like, feeling awake. It's like those things feel kind of ritualistic and kind of rigorous sometimes. I'm like, oh my gosh, I really don't want to make that smoothie. And yet it's like, okay, but like you said, this feels sort of in the trenches sometimes, especially if it's an emotionally difficult story, like you said, and you're working through issues. Like Joan Didion says, I write to understand what I'm thinking, to understand what I fear. I'm not quoting her exactly, but it's a beautiful quote by her. And it's like you're trying to figure out those things that are your obsessions, or those things that have sort of bothered you or haunted you for so much of your life. That's not a joke to get through that, and get through it kind of alone. Of course, you can have a writing group, and you have your lovely writing friends and people on Twitter that you connect with who are in the book community. But in the end, it's you with your thoughts and your words. And you need to have that balance. Balance is a weird word because sometimes I feel like it's not really balanced, but it's a little bit of other stuff, to keep you from being in your head, 24 hours of the day, every single second,
Definitely.
So,
Yeah, I think that is an important conversation, especially in this weird world we're in, where like I don't leave my house every day. Like I leave my house maybe like once a week, and you're always, there's just it's so different, now, especially too being trapped in your house with your family all the time. It's interesting. So I think having that perspective to be able to just really focus on taking care of yourself throughout this process is so important. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I have just one final question. I have been told by multiple people that it's the hardest question I ask, so I do apologize. But I would love to know what your favorite book is right now. This is not your favorite book of all time, just something you've read recently that you're like super excited to tell all your friends about.
Yeah, I actually loved the way you worded this question because of the word right now.
Right.
What is your favorite book right now? It does feel like, wow, there are so many favorite books in the world, but the ones that I have been sort of swept away by or just blown away by, one is called A Burning by Megha Majumdar. She's a debut author, and I'm sure you've heard of it. It's done very well, and but it's about 3 contemporary characters in India who seek to rise in general. The way they describe it, the synopsis: one to the middle class, one to political power, and one to fame in the movies. But they find their lives intertwined in the wake of this disaster that happens in current day India. It is just, it tackles so many complex themes, and yet with this very spare, beautiful kind of prose, and you really, you hear from the three different characters from their point of view, and so they're all from like very different parts of society, and it was just a very, gosh, it was just so gripping. I couldn't believe how much she accomplished in that one book.
Love that.
And it blew me away. Yeah, so it's called A Burning.
Wonderful. Ooh, I see it here on your Goodreads. I was just looking it up. And you posted a great review of it.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
I loved that one. And I'm also reading The Dutch House right now,
Ooh.
which I'm loving that as well.
I love this question, even though it can be hard to answer because, you know, there's so many good books out there that we inevitably miss a lot of them, right? So it's always good to get some more book recommendations.
Exactly. And one thing I don't think we talked about today at all was I find it helpful to read outside my genre. So right now I'm writing YA, and I love YA, but it's when you're writing, it's just so delicate. At least for me it is, where I feel like, any little thing can sort of send me off into imposter syndrome land. And it's just like, no, you're not doing that to yourself. Just read, and my like sort of long-time love has been literary fiction. So that's what I sort of enjoy reading. And I find that I'm a little bit less like, okay, let me pick apart what they did here. It's like, okay, let me just enjoy this rather than having everything be, a master text,
Yeah.
Which, of course, that's a wonderful thing, is to have master text, but it's also from, like you were saying, from a mental health standpoint and a sort of just feeling healthy in general standpoint. I do think that reading these stories that don't so closely connect with what you are writing every day is really helpful. So A Burning and The Dutch House are two that are, would have been definitely a very different genre.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those. Thank you so much for chatting with me today and telling me all about your debut novel, your wonderful journey, to being published, being a debut author, and letting me and my listeners get to know you a little bit better.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful, and I'm so honored to be here.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. Please make sure to rate and review it, share it with your friends, subscribe to it so you never miss an episode, and make sure you check your phones on Friday where we will have another episode drop. See you guys next time.